John the Baptist was arrested. We've talked about this before, but John the Baptist was arrested. When he was arrested, Jesus inherited his ministry. But he did ministry a little bit different than John the Baptist, because Jesus knew if he had the same political message and got involved in politics like John the Baptist, he would be killed and have his head cut off just like John the Baptist did. So he went out and found 12 guys, and he trained those 12 guys to do the same ministry that he was doing so Jesus could hide behind the scenes. But he messed up when he went to Jerusalem, and he said some stuff he shouldn't have said. He flipped over some tables, pissed off the Jews, and guess what happened? Well, he died, but before he died, he got arrested. Yo, welcome back to another Bible study with me, and today we are going to be going over Matthew chapter 11. Now, for those of you who just landed on this video for the first time, let me tell you what we're doing. Basically, we're doing a Bible study, and it's a Bible study with me. We're going through the entire Gospel of Matthew. We've already done chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, and today we are doing chapter 11. Now, basically what we're doing is we're going through the chapter. I'm putting the text on the screen so you can read it along with me. We read the text verse by verse and explain it as we go. There are three things that we typically look for, which is history, theology, and spirituality. And so basically on any given video, we could be talking about all three of them, or one of them, or whatever. I mean, we're kind of spontaneous in this Bible study. There's really no set thing. It's going to be one of those three things, or all those three things, or two of those three things. The point is that we are going to talk about some history and some theology and spirituality in Matthew chapter 11. Now, let me just also tell you this, that if this is the first video you ever landed on, we have a particular lens that we're viewing this gospel from. And that lens is quite different from what your church views the gospel as. So first of all, just to go over a lens really quickly, a lens is the way in which you view something. You can think of it as the lens in a pair of glasses. So for example, if you were to put glasses on and the lenses were green, everything that you would look at would be green. If the lenses were red, then everything that you'd look at would be red. So we have a lens that we're viewing the gospel from, the Gospel of Matthew from, and that lens is very much different from your church. So what does that actually mean? Well, here's what that means. When you go to church, you are told three basic facts about the Gospel of Matthew, according to the church. The first fact is that it's written probably about 50 AD. The second is that it's written by some guy named Matthew the tax collector. And number three, it's a Jewish gospel. Now also, if you go to Google and you type in who wrote the Gospel of Matthew, chances are you're going to come across one of these Christian churchy websites, and they're going to say it's Matthew the tax collector. If you go to Google and you type in when was the Gospel of Matthew written, guess what's going to happen? Well, the number of 50 AD is going to come up, because that's the church's answer. And most of the websites that you find on the internet are, in fact, churchy websites, okay? In other words, they're run by people who are pastors, or they're endorsed by people who are pastors, or they're funded by people who are pastors, and they're basically just there to help the church grow more in their traditions. So that's what your church is going to tell you. We, however, on this YouTube channel, we are a Bible study, and we take the Bible seriously. And our focus is not to talk about what you're talking about in church, nor is it to talk about what your pastor is talking about in church, nor is it to talk about what these other websites are talking about in your church, nor is it to talk about anything that any church is talking about. What we're doing in this YouTube channel is we're kind of going the other way, and we're starting to have more conversations about what scholars are talking about, what people in universities are talking about. So we're going more of the academic route. But don't let the word academic scare you. That would be a very bad idea for you to do. The word academic is not a bad word. It's a very good word, and you should not let it scare you. The reason why is simply because of this. The best place to go and get the best information about the Bible is, in fact, the academic world, aka scholars or universities or whatever you'd like to call them. So our channel here is about going and looking at some of these scholars and talking about some of the things that they're talking about and trying to bring some of that information, or at least the information that's compatible with church, to the internet, and try to break it down and make it easy to understand for most people, so we can begin to talk about it. So when we're talking about the Gospel of Matthew on this YouTube channel, we're not talking about the stuff you're listening to in your church. And we're not talking about the stuff that your church is telling you, and we're not talking about the stuff that your pastor is telling you. Everything that they're telling you is it's from something called church tradition, meaning that that's what the church has believed for the past 2,000 years, and they're going to continue believing it for the next 2,000 years. But just because they believed it for 2,000 years doesn't actually mean that it's correct. So we're looking toward scholars, and we're talking about what scholars are talking about. Most scholars today are going to tell you that we do not know who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Some scholars just say they were written anonymously. But one thing is for certain, Matthew the tax collector did not write the Gospel of Matthew. We don't know who wrote the Gospel of Matthew, pure and simple. Number 2, Matthew's Gospel was written after 70 AD. It was written about 80 to 85 AD. That's what most scholars think. And so those are the two major facts that we're going with. So our lens that we're viewing the gospel from is we're saying we don't know who wrote it, and it was written after the destruction of Jerusalem that occurred in 70 AD. We're saying it was written about 80 to 85 AD, not 50 AD. Okay, so this would be called a later date, if you will. Also, the third thing that we're going with, and this is not a majority view of scholars. This is just something that scholars debate back and forth on, and there's not really a consensus on this. But the big debate is Matthew's gospel Jewish or is it Gentile? And since your church is telling you that it's Jewish, we, however, are telling you the exact opposite. We're saying that it's a Gentile gospel. So when we read this gospel, we have this lens, and we're saying we don't know who wrote it. We know it was written after the destruction of Jerusalem that occurred in 70 AD. And we're also saying that it was a Gentile who wrote it, and it was written to Gentiles, and it was written for Gentiles. In other words, this is not a Jewish gospel. And lots of people want to know why you would do something like that. Well, here's why. Scholars really don't have anything to do with churches, and churches don't really want anything to do with scholars. And what you end up finding out, if you're a person who takes the Bible seriously and you study seriously, what you end up finding out is that there's this huge disagreement between what the church is telling you and what scholars are telling you. And for those of you young people out there who are, maybe perhaps you're even older, if you decide to go to seminary, what you're going to find out are a lot of the things that I talk about on this channel. And what you're going to find out is that the stuff that you were told in church is not necessarily the stuff that's actually really true, or at least what we think is true, put it that way. In other words, there's this big difference between what scholars think and what the church thinks. And most of the time, a lot of what the church thinks is just simply not true. There's no real evidence for it. And so it creates a little bit of a problem. Also, the point of the matter is this, is that if you want to know what your church is saying, you can just go to your church and find out what they're saying, because you're doing that anyways. So why not go on the internet and find somebody else who's talking about other Christian things that are not really popular in your church? In other words, if you want to grow in knowledge, that's what you're going to have to do. And if you really want to grow in knowledge and you're looking for a place to get reliable information of stuff that your church is not talking about, that's like way more advanced than what your church is talking about, then this YouTube channel is for you, because it's designed for people like you. We're not talking about little tiny baby stuff. We're not talking about church stuff. We're not talking about stuff that makes you feel good. We're purposely talking about higher end stuff, more advanced things that scholars talk about, so we can get other people exposed to some of the issues that scholars talk about. And more importantly, some of the issues that surround the Bible. For example, like authorship and errors in the Bible and mistakes in the Bible and contradictions in the Bible and this, that, and the other, and blah, 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 textual criticism, translations. Did the gospel writers change the story of Jesus, and blah, 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 blah. All of these very, very, very important issues that surround the Bible, we talk about them on this channel. So that brings me to the biggest point possible. If that's what you're looking for on the internet, if you're looking for somebody who's like going head deep into this stuff and talking about it, and there's just really no boundaries, because we don't have any boundaries. We are talking about all the stuff that's off limits, and we're doing it from a Christian perspective, but we're not doing it from a dogmatic perspective. So that's important to understand. But if you're interested in learning more about the Bible and learning more about these issues that surround the Bible, more stuff about history, you want to know more stuff about theology, and you want to know more stuff about spirituality, this is the channel for you. And all you have to do is go and click the subscribe button and hit the little bell notification. And every time I upload a new video, you'll be notified that I uploaded a new video. Because right now I'm uploading a new video every day on the Gospel of Matthew, and that's what we're doing with a Bible study with me. We're going through the entire Gospel of Matthew, and we're reading it word for word, and we're studying it, and we're looking for history, spirituality, and theology. And, over the past couple of videos, just to bring you up to date, we've talked a lot about John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth and the 12 disciples, and how they were all prepared for ministry, and how John the Baptist grew his ministry, how Jesus grew his ministry, and how the disciples grew their ministry. In other words, we focused a lot on history. And what we're going to find out here in chapter 11 is a little bit of a continuation of that. In other words, we're going to continue talking about John the Baptist, Jesus of Nazareth, and his disciples, and how this whole Christian movement really started. Of course, this is stuff you're not going to hear in your church, because they don't want you to really know too much about that. But there is a phrase in John's gospel. It's very interesting. Lots of pastors quote this, but it's amazing because they don't actually quote it correctly. What they say is this. The phrase in John's gospel is this: I must decrease so he can increase. This is apparently what John the Baptist said. But that's not actually correct. John the Baptist probably didn't say that. I don't think he did. You can debate in the comments of whether or not you think he did, but I don't think he did. Here's the point. I think it's more illustrative. In other words, John the Baptist was arrested. We've talked about this before, but John the Baptist was arrested. When he was arrested, Jesus inherited his ministry. When I say inherited, I literally mean Jesus came along and took over John the Baptist's ministry. But he did ministry a little bit different than John the Baptist, because Jesus knew if he had the same political message and got involved in politics like John the Baptist, he would be killed and have his head cut off just like John the Baptist did. So he went out and found 12 guys, and he trained those 12 guys to do the same ministry that he was doing so Jesus could hide behind the scenes. But he messed up when he went to Jerusalem, and he said some stuff he shouldn't have said. He flipped over some tables, pissed off the Jews, and guess what happened? Well, he died, but before he died, he got arrested. So basically, the thing he was trying to avoid with Jesus, or with John the Baptist, he was trying to avoid that same thing, and it actually ended up happening to him. So that's very interesting to understand about the history of the gospel. And it's particularly important to understand here about the Gospel of Matthew, because when we get to chapter 23 and 24, what you're going to see is this climactic event where this same exact scene happens, where Jesus makes the same mistake that John the Baptist made. But we're not talking about that today, because we're talking about chapter 11. So let's go ahead and dive into the text. But before we do, I have this amazingly ugly picture I have to show you. And for those of you who have been following this series, you know every single time I do this video, and in this series, I always put this picture up in the middle of the video simply because it's very funny. And I've explained to you why I think it's funny, simply because I have nothing better to do, and it makes me laugh, and hopefully it might make you laugh, because it's absolutely hilarious. So here we are in Matthew chapter 11, and this is the first 10 verses. And, you can see my ugly face down here on the right-hand side of your screen if you want to look at it, or you can just look at the text. But this chapter is pretty short. It's not very long like some of the other chapters we have read. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and read it because it makes more sense to read it than it does to talk about it. So let's go ahead and read it. Beginning up here in verse 1, it says, after Jesus had finished instructing his disciples, his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John the Baptist, who was in prison, heard of the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? Jesus replied, go back and report to John the Baptist what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. Verse 7. As John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John the Baptist. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear fine clothes are in the king's palaces. Then what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. So he's talking about John the Baptist when he was out there in the wilderness and preaching and teaching and baptizing people in water and baptizing people in the Jordan River, which of course is the same baptism where Jesus was baptized. He was baptized by John the Baptist. Here are the other verses. This is verse 11 to 19, and starting in verse 11, it says, truly I tell you, this is Jesus still speaking, by the way. It says, truly I tell you, among those born of women, there had not been raised anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet whoever is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. For the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been subject to violence, and violent people have been raiding it. For all the prophets in the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. Whoever has an ear, let him hear. To what can I compare this generation? They are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling out to others. Verse 17, the section right here, he says, we played the pipe for you, and you did not dance. We sang, and you did not mourn. By the way, I just want to highlight this section really quick because I want to come back to verse 15 and talk about it, but we'll finish reading verse 18 and 19 really quick. Here's what it says. For John came near eating, for John did not come eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say he is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved by her deeds. So, let me erase this stuff and look here at verse 15. If you are familiar with the New Testament, one major book you are familiar with then would be the book of Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, it has this phrase. It says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And I did a whole series on the end times, and actually, in fact, I'm still doing that series on the end times. We're just not posting as much in it. We're just kind of posting once or twice a month now, and we'll develop that series as it goes because there's a lot of stuff about the end times and eschatology that we can go on about. But I did some stuff on the book of Revelation, and what I want you to understand about the book of Revelation is this. First of all, your church has got it all wrong. That's the first thing. Secondly, I'm sorry, I just had to say it's too good to be true. Secondly, I just want to tell you that most of these authors out there, these Christian authors, these Christian books, whether they're preterism or partial preterism or futurism or amillennialism, premillennialism or post-tribulation or dispensationalism, guess what? They're all wrong too. I don't agree with any of those people. To me, they're all wrong. And the reason why they're all wrong is because, number one, they don't really know a whole lot about history. And number two, they refuse to work history into their theology. So in other words, they don't use history to build theology. They just have theology without history. And to me, that's like clouds without water. So it doesn't really work very well. Here's the point. I don't think that the book of Revelation was written by John the Apostle. Okay, lots of other scholars kind of think that too. Or at least what they say is that whoever wrote the Gospel of John is not the same John who wrote the book of Revelation. That's a topic for another time, but just to understand that I don't think that John the Apostle wrote the book of Revelation. Some guy named John, but whoever that John is, I don't know. Also, let me tell you, it's most definitely written in 95, toward probably 100 AD. It could even be 120 AD. It's definitely written way after the Gospels and way after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. I know the preterists are going to tell you that's just not true. But look, as again, I'll say it again, the preterists have no idea what they're talking about. If you're a preterist, I'm not sorry. You should be sorry. You don't know what you're talking about. Go read some books. Learn something. I'm not trying to sound mean or arrogant, but honestly, there's no real scholar who's going to sit here and say, yes, the book of Revelation was written before 70 AD. That's just absolutely moronic. There's no scholar who thinks that. Preterism is heresy, in my opinion. I did a whole video on it. You can search it. Preterism is heresy. Anyways, the point is that the book of Revelation is written in after 70 AD, probably toward 100 AD, maybe 120 AD. And it's probably not written by John the Apostle. But what's interesting is why the book was written. And this is the point that I want to make very plain to you. You think, because your church has told you this, and your pastors have told you this, and all these Christian authors have told you this, that this is sort of like the final revelation. Even if you're a preterist, you still believe that. You still think this is the final revelation. You just think it's the final revelation about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which doesn't really make sense because 7 of the churches in there have nothing to do with Jerusalem. So good luck explaining that. And it's, 1,200 miles away. So good luck explaining that. It's 800 miles when you fly, but it's 1,200 through the... Anyways, here's what's crazy. If you change your mind about this point and you start to think about why the book of Revelation was written, and you start to think, well, wait a second, maybe it's not written as a final revelation. Maybe it was written by someone who's not an apostle, and it's written because the early church expected the second coming of Christ to physically come in their lifetime. So because what you have to understand about the New Testament is that when you read it, it's talking about the second coming of Christ. Almost all the books talk about the second coming of Christ. They talk about Jesus coming back in the clouds, physically coming back in the clouds. This is not judgment language. This is like literal. This is what they thought. The Apostle Paul thought this as well. And what's interesting is that if you take that idea, if you accept that idea, and you start to think about it, because we do have hints and pieces in here, especially in the pastorals, where people started to think, and 2 Thessalonians as well, where people started to think that Jesus had already come back, that they had missed the resurrection, and all this stuff. So we know that there was different teachings springing up about why Jesus had not come back yet. In other words, that tells you that people were expecting him to come back in the first century. Well, he never came back, and the kingdom of God never came back either. Okay, because the kingdom of God was expected to come. It was a physical, literal kingdom that was supposed to come in their lifetime. The kingdom of God never came, and Jesus never came back. So now what? Well, here we are pushing toward the first century, or the second century, and some people got together. By this time, all of Judaism is destroyed. It's destroyed in the Jewish-Roman War, so there's no Jews left. Now there's only the Gentile church, and they're running for their lives, hoping to not be persecuted under Domitian and some other emperors. Basically, long story short, why is the book of Revelation written? Well, I think the book of Revelation is written as a hope, because in there it says, I'm coming soon, I'm coming soon. So it's written as a reassurance that Jesus is still, in fact, coming. And you hear that phrase, he who hears, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the church. And here we see in Matthew's gospel, this is another way we know Matthew's gospel is written later on. We also have noted that Matthew's gospel has a lot of eschatology in it, a lot of eschatology that's similar to the book of Revelation. In other words, we can see this development of eschatology, we can see this development of end times teaching, and how it's sort of being centered on Jesus is coming back, and also being centered on the reassurance, because a lot of people were doubting it. And that's one of the ways you know preterism is heresy, because preterism is the doubter. They're just doubting it in the modern times, right? So the way that preterists doubt the second coming of Christ today is exactly how people were doubting preterism, doubting the second coming of Jesus and the resurrection in the first century. So that's how you know it's heresy. And besides, 2 Corinthians and the pastorals as well both condemn heresy. So look, when I say preterism is heresy, that's not my opinion. It's actually something that's in the Bible. And if you spend some time reading the Bible and reading the New Testament and understanding the eschatology that's in the New Testament, you'll find out yourself that preterism is nothing new. It's not a new belief. It's an old belief that existed in the first century, and it was condemned by the early church. So, besides all that stuff, Matthew's gospel is written about 80 to 85 AD, and we have the same phrase, which is obviously pointing more toward a Gentile community. He who has an ear, let him hear. Do I think that Jesus actually said this word? I don't know. It's very hard to say. But what I will say is that it does show us a lot into the teaching, and of course, this whole aspect of hearing God, hearing what the Spirit says, and hearing he who has an ear, let him hear. This whole aspect comes from this idea that Jesus is coming back. And that's why you need to hear. You need to be able to hear because Jesus is coming back. It's a very interesting concept to understand. If you don't think that's true, that's fine. I don't really care. But you know what you should do? Go into the New Testament and look for every phrase where it talks about having an ear and hearing, and examine all those passages and look at them in context. And you know what you'll find? Exactly what I just told you, because that's what I did and that's what I found. And I seriously doubt you're going to find anything different. Anyways, let's go on to the last part of the passage here. By the way, I just want to say this is the last part. So, but before we read it, I just want to make this point. You know, that little discourse that I just did, little detour where we talked about some eschatology in the book of Revelation and how everybody's wrong. You know, that totally is probably like the worst thing for me to say in terms of like reputation or whatever. And it's like not good for me to say that stuff. But sometimes the only way to communicate is just to say it very clearly. People are wrong and they don't want to admit they're wrong, you know, and sometimes you just have to tell people they're just wrong and leave it at that. But I'll tell you this, the New Testament is very easy to understand when you begin to understand that it's primarily eschatology. Most importantly, when you begin to understand that Jesus and John the Baptist were apocalyptic prophets, and they both had apocalyptic gospel messages, and that their entire movement, along with the apostles, were an apocalyptic movement like the Essenes. Okay, then all of a sudden you start to realize that this is an apocalyptic Jewish group, right, who eventually turned Gentile because of the Apostle Paul. And then you start to realize the Apostle Paul is probably an apocalyptic gospel preacher because he's preaching an apocalyptic gospel message. And once you begin to understand that, then all of a sudden you start to realize everything is about the last days or the end times or eschatology, if you will. They're a whole movement that looks forward to the future, okay? And of course, that future has not come yet, and so it begs the question, did they get it right? Was Jesus a failed apocalyptic prophet? Is this stuff actually true? Is it going to happen? Has it not happened yet? If it's already has happened, how come there's stuff in there that clearly has not happened yet? Lots of people get mixed up in all this stuff. These are the details that sell books. These are the details where preterists get popular. These are the details where dispensationalists get popular. These are the details that people argue about in Bible study. And what I'm going to tell you, and this is wise advice, by the way, don't go down those rabbit holes. They're not important. They're not worth your time. They're a waste of time. They're a waste of energy. They're a waste of study. There's no point in going down those roads. There's thousands and thousands of books published on that crap. There's no need to go down that. What you need to start researching is Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet. Find out what that term means. In fact, one book you should read is by Albert Schweitzer, have it on my bookshelf. It's actually right above my head here. It's called The Quest for the Historical Jesus. It's the first quest for the historical Jesus, and that's where your study should start. If you want to know some stuff about apocalypticism and Jesus being an apocalyptic prophet, that's where you need to start. You want to know some stuff about eschatology? That's where you need to start. Not reading these popular books and Left Behind and all that crap, and that stuff's not going to help you because they don't know what they're talking about, right? They just don't know. They're people who are building theology without history. Go read some stuff about the historical Jesus. Then you'll start to understand who Jesus was as a historical person and some of the historical things that scholars think may have happened. And then you can begin to build theology. That's how you do it. So we're going to go ahead here and read the rest of this passage. And this is the last part of Matthew's Gospel. It's in chapter 11, verses 20 to 30. And here is what it says. Then Jesus began to denounce the towns in which most of his miracles had been performed, because they did not repent. Woe to you! Woe to you, and woe to you, all these towns that he went to. I don't know how to pronounce these towns, but that's what they are. Anyways, for if the miracles that... That's so hilarious. I probably shouldn't say that, but I just did. Verse 21. For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, I can't pronounce that either. Blah blah blah. Tirade and Sidon. I don't know. I don't know how you pronounce these names, and I'm not in the mood to go and figure it out. Anyways, 'cause I'm like really tired, by the way. Starting right here in the rest of verse 21, this is like the longest verse of my life. They would have repented long ago if in sackcloth and ashes. Blah 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 blah. That's the probably the worst reading of any Bible passage I've ever done in my life. Apparently, I don't know how to read Matthew chapter 11 verse 21. So, yeah, you can yell and scream at me in the comments if you want to. Verse 22. But I tell you, it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you. Again, here we see more eschatology, the day of judgment. Verse 23. And you, Capernaum, will you be lifted up to the heavens? No, you will be thrown down to Hades. For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Sodom, it would have remained to this day. But I tell you, it would have been more bearable for Sodom on the day of judgment than for you. Again, if you really want to understand what Jesus is talking about here, you're going to have to understand him as an apocalyptic prophet. Verse 25. At that time, Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children. Yes, the Father for this. Yes, Father, my God in heaven. I am horrible at reading the NIV. I should not read this anymore, but you know what? That's the translation you people like to use, so that's what I'm going to use. Number 27. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. I'll tell you this, and I say this all the time, the King James is way better, the New King James is way better for verse 28. Take up my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Very interesting stuff here. Very, very interesting stuff. I do apologize about verse 21. That was like horrible. I have not read this passage in a very long time. And furthermore, believe it or not, I've said this before. I'll say it again for the newcomers. I don't read the NIV. The only time I ever use the NIV are in these videos because most people use the NIV. And I don't use the NIV. I pretty much just use, if I'm going to do personal readings like we're doing right now, I use the New King James. And for academic stuff, you know, when I have to publish papers or something like that, I use the New American Standard most of the time. unless the occasion arises where I get to use the New King James, which is not very much. Because I know that people in the church today, or at least they're a dying breed, by the way. And there's a book right here that's about it. It's called King James Only Controversy. It's by James White. You should read it. Basically, long story short, there are people out there who think that the King James Version is the best version ever. And it might be true that it's the best English version, as in it's poetic and it rhymes really well and it reads really well. But in terms of textual copying, in terms of being the more precise biblical accounts from the manuscripts that we have, from the copies of the copies of the copies of the copies that we have, it's not very reliable. So that's why when you open up your NIV Bible, there's some missing verses, like they're purposely missing. I'll mention those places later on down the road, but there are some stuff missing in your NIV. The reason, and if you compare it to your King James Bible, you'll realize, wait a second, it's there in the King James, but it's not there in the NIV. Why? Because our earliest and best reliable manuscripts do not have those verses. It's because some other scribes came along and added those verses. One example is something called the Johannine comma. It's First John chapter 5, 23, 29, something like that. It says the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's called the Johannine comma. Basically, long story short, it's in the King James, but it's not in your other translations. The reason why is because some scribe came along and said, we got to prove the Trinity. And so they wrote that phrase in there. The problem is that it's not in our earliest manuscripts. And we found earlier manuscripts since then, and we have thus proven that those words were never originally a part of the Epistle of John. All kinds of really cool stuff like that about the New Testament and the Old Testament as well. So anyways, the point of the matter is that I don't really read the NIV too much. And so sometimes when I read it, it's like a little bit blurry because I have passages memorized in the New King James. And I know it says it way better in the New King James than it does in the NIV, because the New King James is way more poetic and it has more rhyming stuff. So, for example, when you read this passage in the New King James, it's so much better. It says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and all you who are laden and weary and heavy burdens." It just makes more sense. It says, "Take up my yoke." Here in the NIV, it says it a little bit different. It says, "Take up my yoke upon you." And in the New King James, it doesn't say that. It just says, "Take up my yoke and learn from me." So little nuances, a little bit different, but it's one of those things. When you read a lot of the Bible and you read a lot of the stuff in one particular translation and then you just switch to another, it's very hard to read it because the nuances definitely stand out a lot. And one translation I will never read, one translation I will never ever use, one translation I will probably never teach from is the New Living Translation, because to me, it's absolutely horrible. I'm sure it's a good translation, but it's just not for me. Especially like when you come from the King James stuff and the New American Standard, when you read those two versions a lot, and of course now I'm reading the NIV a lot more. Also, by the way, this is the 2011 NIV. Keep that in mind, because the 1984 NIV is entirely different. And if you really want to read a very good NIV, you need to go get your hands on a 1984 NIV, which I have a couple of them down there. So when I do read the NIV, it's going to be in the 1984 edition, but we're reading the 2011 edition, which is entirely different from the other ones. So I have stuff in there that I memorized as a teenager that is not in the version that we're reading, particularly in the book of Galatians. So as you can see, it's like I'm reading the Bible all over again, and I have no idea what I'm talking about, which, by the way, serves you, not me, okay? Because I spent my whole life studying this stuff. I'm fine. Like, I don't have anything to worry about. You, on the other hand, there's lots of stuff that you need to see. And I think the biggest thing you need to see is the struggle that people have of reading different versions and teaching from different versions and trying to communicate differently from those different versions. And I just want you to know, it's difficult sometimes. Sometimes it's easy, but a lot of times it's very difficult. So if you're a pastor or a minister out there, Yeah, I'll give you one really good advice. First of all, don't do what I'm doing. Make sure you go ahead and read it and practice it before you go to church. That's a good idea. But we're on the internet and we're on YouTube, and you basically get to do what you want. So I don't practice. I just read it. So I have no idea what I'm reading until I actually read it. The first time I read it is the first time I read it here. So that's my suggestion. If you ever do something like this, if you're ever going to preach a sermon somewhere, make sure you read the passage you're going to read a lot of times and then go read it. So that way it doesn't sound horrible like we're doing here. So, yeah, maybe I'll take my own advice in the next video. I don't know. We'll see. But that's what's so great about this channel is that we have no right way or wrong way of doing anything. We're very spontaneous. We wing things. And we're totally fine with not being right and not being wrong. We're totally open to doing new things because we don't want to go with what everybody else is doing. We want to do our own thing, and that's why you should subscribe, because this channel is entirely different from what everybody else is doing. By the way, how many people are actually doing a freaking Bible study that's 40 minutes long, and it's a legit Bible study where you actually learn stuff? Not a lot of people, I'll tell you that. So go ahead and hit subscribe, because we're different, and we're actually studying the Bible, and you're learning stuff. Hit subscribe, hit the bell notification, and give me a thumbs up. Let me know you like the video, because if you don't let me know you like the video by giving me a thumbs up, I don't know that you actually liked it. I have no way of knowing unless you give it a thumbs up. So go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Also, if you want to disagree with me, comment below and tell me. I read all the comments. So, yeah. And I'll try to respond to as many as I possibly can. Sometimes you just can't respond. But yeah, I'll respond. Go ahead and comment. I like reading people's comments. I like reading people's stories. I like reading about what people are learning. And if this video has helped you, let me know. Again, I like hearing about what people are learning and where they're at in their life. And yeah, I just like hearing from people. So go ahead and give it a comment. A good comment, too. That'd be cool. Because Bible interpretation is best done in community. So that's about it. Oh, follow me on Instagram at Adam Jorden Clark, because I'm on Instagram. And yeah, the videos are shorter there, but they're not as good as this. So go follow me on Instagram. I talk about some other stuff on there. And yeah, you can comment on me there. You can talk to me there too as well. So that's cool. All right, guys. Well, it's been fun. And I hope to see you in the next video. And as always, I'll see you in the next video. If you like this video and want to know more, you can hit the subscribe button for more videos. If you have a question or a comment, or maybe you just like to say something or express your opinion, go ahead and comment that below. And like the video if you like the video, because liking the video is always a good thing when you like the video. My name is Adam Jorden Clark, and you can find out more about me if you like at my website, adamjordenclark.com. And as always, I will see you in the next video.